The laughter started with the Pelthar delegation. They were known across the council as the most intellectually composed species in known space, proud of their measured responses and their careful reasoning, the kind of representatives who treated every presentation with the formal seriousness that the chamber required. Dara had actually counted on that. She had told herself during the long transit to council headquarters that whatever else happened in that room, the Pelthar would at least hear her out properly before forming a judgment. The first Pelthar laugh came at the 4-minute mark of her presentation. By the 6-minute mark, every species in the chamber had joined in, some with sounds and some with gestures and some with the particular body language that crossed species lines, because dismissal looks roughly the same in every culture that has ever developed one. 11 civilizations, the most powerful in the known galaxy, finding the same thing funny at the same time. It was almost impressive in its unanimity. Dara stood at the center of the great chamber and held her data tablet with both hands and kept her face still. She was young for an archaeologist, barely into her 2nd century, which in her species placed her somewhere in the equivalent of her early 30s by the old human calendar she had learned about in her studies, young enough that senior colleagues still occasionally referred to her work as promising rather than accomplished. She had spent 3 years on this specific research. 3 years of transit permits and excavation licenses and equipment requisitions, and the particular grinding patience required to work at the edge of the void where the council's administrative reach was thin and the support infrastructure was essentially non-existent. She had done it because the evidence led there and she followed evidence. That was the whole of her methodology and always had been. The evidence she had found was unlike anything in the academic record. The station sat at coordinates that placed it technically outside council jurisdiction, in the boundary region between registered space and the void that every chart marked as empty and that every experienced pilot knew to avoid for reasons that the official documentation described as radiation and spatial anomalies, and that the unofficial documentation, the kind passed between crews and transit lounges, described with considerably more specific concern. She had reached it on her 3rd attempt, the first 2 having been turned back by equipment issues that she now suspected were less coincidental than they had seemed at the time. It was intact. That was the first thing that stopped her. 2,000 years at the edge of the void and it was intact, which should not have been possible given what the void did to materials that were not specifically engineered to survive it. The station's hull was built from something her instruments could measure in terms of density and energy interaction but could not match to any known compound in any database she had access to. She had taken samples. Her best colleagues had analyzed them. 3 separate laboratories had returned the same result, which was essentially a sophisticated way of saying they had no idea what they were looking at. Inside, the power systems were running at low capacity. Not emergency reserve, not the last flickering output of something dying. Low capacity in the way a system runs when it is deliberately conserving energy for a long period with the intention of having full capacity available when it was needed again. The data cores were intact and accessible and went back further than the council's own founding records, which was not supposed to be possible because the council's historians had always operated on the understanding that nothing meaningful predated their own institutional memory. That understanding was wrong. Dara had spent 3 months after her initial discovery doing nothing but reading. She had not slept properly in most of that time. She had not spoken to anyone outside her immediate team about what she was finding because the finding was large enough that sharing it prematurely felt dangerous in a way she could not fully articulate. She had compiled everything into the most careful and thorough presentation she had produced in her career, and she had submitted the formal request for council time, and she had waited 6 weeks for approval and then made the transit to headquarters and stood in the preparation room outside the great chamber for 2 hours before her name was called. She had been genuinely nervous. Not about the evidence, which was solid, but about the room, which was not known for its patience with unconventional findings. The nervousness had not prepared her for the laughter. Supreme Commander Vex occupied the highest platform in the chamber. She was the most decorated military figure in the known galaxy, the being responsible for the security architecture of Council space, the commander who had personally overseen the expansion of Council territory by 11 systems in the last 30 years. Her armor-like skin caught the light from above and her 4 eyes were fixed on Dara with an expression that was not quite contempt and not quite amusement but contained elements of both in proportions that Dara found difficult to look at directly. Vex had apparently agreed to this presentation as a professional courtesy to Dara's department head. That courtesy had visibly expired somewhere around the moment Dara first said the word Terran. "You are asking this council," Vex said, when the laughter had reduced enough for her voice to carry without effort, "to redirect resources and attention based on children's stories." "The station exists," Dara said. She kept her voice level. "The materials are real. The data cores are real. The records inside them are real and they go back further than any archive this council maintains. Evidence can be misread. Council member Foss spoke from the far side of the chamber, his translated voice carrying the particular tone of someone who has already decided the conclusion and is now selecting the reasoning to support it. Especially by a researcher who has invested significant time and resources in finding a specific result. I did not go looking for Terrans, Dara said. I went looking for the source of anomalous energy readings in the boundary region. The station is what the readings led me to. I did not choose what I found. Nobody responded to that. The matter was formally closed 7 minutes later. Her findings were entered into the official record with the standard language used for submissions that the council had received and noted and had no intention of acting on. She was thanked by name. She was informed that her departmental reassignment had been approved. She was wished well in her future work in a tone that made the future work sound very small and very far from anything that mattered. She bowed the required depth and left the chamber. The corridor outside was long and empty and very quiet after the noise of the chamber. She walked slowly, not because she was tired but because she was doing the thing she always did after a significant experience, which was letting it settle before she decided what it meant. At the end of the corridor she stopped. She looked at her tablet. The power readings from the station were still on her primary screen where she had left them during the presentation. She had looked at them more times than she could count over the past 3 months. She knew every number, every fluctuation pattern, every detail in the data that her instruments had recorded during her time aboard. She had not shared her interpretation of those readings with the council. She had made that decision consciously 2 days before the presentation, sitting in her transit cabin going through her notes and reaching the section on power output and stopping there. She had looked at the readings for a long time and then made a judgment call that she was not certain was right but that she had committed to anyway. The evidence she had was already going to be difficult enough to present without adding the interpretation that had been sitting at the back of her mind since her 3rd day aboard the station. The interpretation was simple. The readings did not match any profile in her databases for a system that had been in low power conservation mode for 2,000 years. The decay patterns were wrong. The output stability was wrong. Everything that a system showed after 2 millennia of unattended operation was absent from these readings. What the readings matched, precisely and consistently, was a system that had recently transitioned from a dormant state into an active one. Not 2,000 years of quiet waiting. Something that had woken up recently. Something that was aware now in a way it had not been before. Something that her instruments had recorded in the middle of her 3-week survey and that she had noted in her logs with careful neutral language that did not say what she actually thought it meant. She stood in the empty corridor outside the chamber where 11 species had just finished laughing at her life's work and looked at the readings on her screen. The station was not dead. It had just woken up. And she was the only person in the known galaxy who knew it. The basement archive had not been meaningfully organized in at least 40 years. Dara could tell this from the filing system, which had started as something logical and had accumulated decades of exceptions and shortcuts and temporary placements that became permanent through sheer inertia until the whole thing was less a system and more a record of every decision that had ever been made in a hurry and never revisited. Crates of minor artifacts sat in rows that only made sense if you already knew what you were looking for. Cataloging terminals ran software that predated 3 separate council administrative reforms. The climate controls worked well enough to preserve the contents but not well enough to make the space comfortable for anyone working in it. It was, in every practical sense, a place where things were sent to be forgotten. Dara had been assigned here 3 weeks ago with a formal letter that used the word reassignment 4 times and the word opportunity twice and that she had read once and filed and not read again. Her new supervisor had explained her responsibilities in a meeting that lasted 8 minutes and had the atmosphere of someone who had been told to process a personnel transfer and wanted to complete that task as efficiently as possible. She had been shown her workstation, given her access credentials, and left alone in the basement with several hundred uncatalogued items and no particular deadline. She catalogued steadily and without complaint during working hours. Then at the end of each day when the building emptied out and the security log on her floor shifted to its overnight passive mode, she opened her bag and took out the drives. 4 of them, each one holding a portion of the data she had pulled from the Terran station's cores during her 3 weeks aboard. She had been methodical about the extraction, working through the archive structure systematically rather than searching for specific things, because she had not known what she was looking for and the only reliable way to find something you cannot anticipate is to look at everything. The total data volume was larger than her personal equipment could hold comfortably, which was why she had spread it across 4 drives and why she had kept those drives in her bag rather than on any network device since the day she returned from the void. She worked through the nights with the terminals on low brightness and her notes kept in a handwritten format that existed nowhere in the Council's systems. What she found was not what she had expected. She had expected history. Records of a civilization, accounts of their development and their achievements and eventually their disappearance. The kind of archive that a species might leave behind when they understood that leaving something behind was better than leaving nothing. She had expected it to be significant and she had expected it to be sad and she had prepared herself for both of those things. She had not prepared herself for what the Terran records actually contained, which was not the history of a civilization that had existed in isolation from the rest of the galaxy but the history of a civilization that had been quietly, carefully, consistently present in the galaxy's development in ways that nothing in any Council database had ever acknowledged or recorded. The interventions were documented in detail. Not boastfully. The records were written in a tone that was almost clinical, the tone of people logging actions taken rather than accomplishments achieved. A young species in a system 3,000 light-years from Terran space had been facing a collision event that their early technology could not address. The record showed a Terran engineering team dispatched, the problem resolved, the team withdrawn before any contact could be made. The entry was 4 sentences long and was filed between 2 other entries of similar length about completely different events in completely different parts of the galaxy. There were hundreds of entries like it. Dara cross-referenced them against Council historical records, working slowly and carefully, checking each event against the survival histories of the species currently represented in the Council chamber where she had been laughed at 3 weeks ago. The matching was not approximate. It was exact, event by event, date by date, the Council's own records confirming again and again that species which should not have survived their early centuries of spaceflight had survived. That civilizations which the historical record showed facing extinction-level threats had come through those threats in ways that the Council's historians had attributed to luck or resilience or the natural robustness of species that eventually reached spaceflight capability. It was not luck. 11 separate events. 11 species currently seated in the Great Council chamber. Every single one of them alive and present and powerful because something had quietly intervened at the right moment and then stepped back into the dark before anyone could see it clearly enough to ask questions. Dara sat with that for a long time. Then she kept reading and found the withdrawal records and sat with those for even longer. The plague had begun in a border system and moved inward faster than any containment effort could manage. The Terran records described it in the same clinical tone as everything else, but the clinical tone could not completely contain what was underneath it, the scale of loss, the speed of it, the way it moved through populations that had no defense against something their biology had never encountered before. Billions of deaths in the first year. More in the second. By the third year the outer colonies were gone and the inner worlds were making decisions about resource allocation that the records described carefully and that Dara read carefully, and that were the kinds of decisions that only get made when every other option has already been exhausted. The withdrawal decision was reached collectively. The records showed the debates, the arguments, the resistance from factions that wanted to fight outward rather than retreat inward, the counter-arguments from those who understood that a plague of unknown origin in a civilization with faster-than-light travel was not something that could be fought outward without becoming something far worse than a tragedy contained to one species. They had chosen to go inward, to seal themselves away, to suffer alone rather than risk spreading the suffering. The final log entries before the withdrawal were written by individuals rather than in the institutional voice of the earlier records. Officers and scientists and administrators writing their last entries before the communication networks went dark, and every one of those entries said some version of the same thing, which was that they believed in what they were choosing and they hoped the galaxy they were leaving would be all right without them for a while. Dara pressed her hand flat against the terminal surface and breathed carefully for a moment. Then she continued. The file-marked threshold condition was near the end of the archive structure, in a section that appeared to have been added later than the surrounding records, written in a slightly different format that suggested a different author or a different period or both. It was not long. 2 pages in the original format, organized as a numbered list with explanatory notes attached to each item. It was a return criteria document. Someone, at some point during the withdrawal or shortly after, had sat down and thought carefully about the question of when it would be appropriate for the Terran Federation to return to a galaxy they had left behind. Not if, when. The document was written with the complete assumption that return was coming, that it was a matter of conditions being met rather than a decision being made, and that the conditions needed to be specific enough to be verifiable and meaningful enough to be worth using as a threshold. Dara read through the list. Political stability across the majority of inhabited space. Check, the Council had maintained that for centuries. The absence of active genocide or species-level extinction programs. Check, mostly with some historical exceptions that the Council's own records were not entirely honest about. The presence of functional diplomatic frameworks between major powers. Check. The existence of unaligned species with genuine autonomy rather than de facto subordination to dominant powers. This one was more complicated and the notes attached to it were longer than the others, as if the author had anticipated that it would be the most contested condition and had wanted to be precise about what they meant. And then the last condition. Authorization and execution of military operations against unaligned species by a dominant power for the purpose of forced absorption rather than genuine security. Dara stopped reading. She went back to the beginning of the list and read it through again from the start, slowly checking each item against what she knew about the current state of the galaxy. She was not trying to find a different result. She was being thorough because thoroughness was how she worked and because the result she had found the first time was significant enough that she wanted to be certain. The result was the same the second time. Every condition had been met. The last one had been met 4 days ago in the same council session where she had stood in the great chamber and been thanked for her dedication and informed of her reassignment. She sat in the cold basement with that understanding and did not move for a while. Outside the building the city continued its normal activity. Inside the archive the rows of forgotten artifacts sat in their imperfect order. The terminal in front of her showed a 2,000-year-old document written by someone who had believed completely in the thing they were building and had wanted to make sure the conditions for returning to it were worth the return. Those conditions were met. Which meant the document was no longer a historical record. It was a current one. Dara pulled up the communication frequency list she had found in a separate section of the archive, the channels marked in the Terran records as monitored, the ones that had not carried a signal in 2,000 years. She looked at them for a long time. Then she opened her notes and began drafting a message. She had been planning it for 4 days without fully admitting to herself that she was planning it. It had started as a practical question. The Terran station records listed specific communication frequencies in a section of the archive that was clearly distinct from the historical logs, written in a more operational format, the kind of format used for active reference material rather than archive documentation. Someone had included those frequencies deliberately, in a document that was meant to be found, in a station that was meant to be discovered. The frequencies were not labeled with explanations. They did not need explanations. Their presence in that specific section of that specific archive meant one thing and it did not require annotation. Dara had copied them into her handwritten notes the night she found them and had not let herself think too carefully about why. For 4 days she had continued her cataloging work during the day and her archive research at night, and she had told herself she was still in the information gathering phase, still building understanding, not yet at the point where understanding needed to become action. It was a reasonable position. It was also, she recognized on the 4th night sitting in the cold basement with her notes open in front of her, not entirely honest. She was afraid. Not of the Council's response, though that was a real and practical concern. Not of being wrong about the frequencies or the threshold conditions or the interpretation she had built carefully over weeks of work. She was afraid of the specific thing that sits between knowing what needs to be done and actually doing it, the gap that exists in every significant decision between the moment you understand the right action and the moment you commit to it. That gap had a particular quality when the action was irreversible and when the consequences extended beyond yourself in ways you could not fully predict. She sat with the fear for a while. Then she thought about the 3 outer species. She had looked them up after finding the threshold condition document. Small civilizations, none of them with more than a handful of inhabited worlds, none of them with military capacity that came anywhere close to what the Council fleet represented. They had maintained their independence through a combination of geographic inconvenience and the Council's historical preference for absorbing species that offered significant resources or strategic positioning. Recent surveys had apparently changed the resource assessment on 2 of their systems. The Council fleet had been authorized and was already moving. Those species did not have 4 days. They barely had weeks. Dara closed her notes, put them in her bag alongside the drives and looked at the clock on the terminal. It was 1:15 in the morning. She waited until 2. The Council communication network required credentials that her reassignment should have deactivated but had not yet because the administrative process that managed credential transitions ran on a quarterly cycle and the cycle had not turned since her reassignment was processed. This was exactly the kind of institutional inefficiency that drove senior administrators into long frustrated meetings and that Dara had quietly relied on without drawing attention to her continued system access. She logged in from the basement terminal using her research credentials and spent 15 minutes navigating to the broadcasting interface that she had identified in the network architecture 3 days ago during what she had told herself was routine familiarization with her new workstation system access. The broadcasting interface allowed transmission on standard council frequencies. It was not designed to access the older channels, the ones outside the standard registry, the ones she had found in the Terran archive data. Those required a manual frequency entry that the system accepted with less resistance than she had expected, as if the underlying infrastructure was older than the interface built on top of it and had been designed for a broader range of frequencies than current council operations required. She entered the Terran frequencies one by one alongside every standard council channel she could access. Then she started writing the message. She had told herself she would keep it short, and she kept that commitment. Not because brevity was strategically optimal, but because the long version of the message was the council chamber presentation and she already knew how that ended. She stated the threshold conditions clearly and confirmed their current status with specific reference to the authorization date of the military operation, which was a matter of public council record and required no classified access to verify. Then she stopped. She sat with the cursor at the end of the last threshold confirmation and thought about what the document had been. A checklist. A specific set of conditions that when met would trigger a return that had apparently been planned 2,000 years ago by people who had thought carefully about when that return would be appropriate. The threshold document was not a request. It was a mechanism. It did not ask for anything. It described conditions, and those conditions being met was itself the signal. Dara understood that. She also understood something else. The civilization described in those archives, the one that had intervened quietly in crisis after crisis across the galaxy without ever asking for acknowledgement, the one that had chosen to suffer alone rather than risk spreading that suffering to others, the one whose final log entries were written by individuals who believed completely in what they were sacrificing and hoped the galaxy would be all right without them. That civilization did not need to be triggered by a mechanism. It deserved to be asked. She wrote one more paragraph. She told them about the 3 outer species. Not their strategic significance. Not their resource profiles, not any of the factors that the council had weighed when deciding to move against them. She described them the way she had come to understand them through 3 days of reading, small civilizations that had maintained their independence carefully and peacefully and that were now in the path of something they had no capacity to resist. She asked for help on their behalf. Not as a condition of anything. Not as a strategic consideration. Just as a request from someone who thought the asking mattered and who had read enough about who she was asking to believe they would think so too. She read it back once. Then she sent it. The wait afterward had a particular quality. She had not expected security to arrive quickly because she had not expected anyone to be actively monitoring transmission logs at 2 in the morning. She had been wrong about that. The Council's communication systems apparently flagged unusual frequency usage automatically regardless of the hour, which was a sensible security architecture that she had not fully accounted for in her planning. 40 minutes after she sent the message, the basement door opened and 2 security officers came down the stairs with the professional manner of people who had been briefed on a situation and were executing a response to it rather than making decisions in real time. They were not aggressive. They identified themselves clearly and explained that she was being detained pending review of unauthorized communication activity, and they gave her a moment to gather her personal items before they processed her out of the building. They took her bag, her tablet, her drives, her handwritten notes. Everything that represented 3 years of work and 3 months of night research in a cold basement was placed in an evidence container and logged and taken away, and she watched it go with the particular feeling of someone watching something leave that they may not see again. The holding cell was on the administrative level, small and clean and very quiet. A bench along one wall, a terminal that was locked to everything except a legal information database, lighting that was functional and nothing more. Dara sat on the bench. She thought about the message and whether it had gone anywhere meaningful or whether the old frequencies were genuinely dead and the whole transmission had simply expanded outward into empty space at the speed of light and would continue doing so for the rest of the universe's existence without anyone ever receiving it. She thought about the threshold document and the careful, precise language of someone who had believed completely in the thing they were building. She thought about the final log entries from people who had not known if anyone would ever read them and who had written them anyway because some things needed to be said regardless of whether they were heard. She had done the only thing available to her. She had known when she sent the message that it might be the only thing. That the frequencies might be dead and the station might have woken up for reasons unrelated to any threshold condition, and the whole framework she had built might be real but simply too late or too early or aimed at something that was not coming regardless of what conditions were met. She had known all of that and she had sent it anyway because the alternative was sitting in a cold basement knowing what she knew and doing nothing, and she was not capable of that. Would have to be enough. She was still sitting with that thought, not quite at peace with it but working toward it, when every light in the building changed. Not went out. Changed. A flicker that lasted less than a second, a brief interruption that passed through the entire building simultaneously in a way that the electrical system of a council administrative building was not architecturally capable of producing because council buildings ran on redundant independent power cells that were specifically designed to prevent simultaneous fluctuation. Then every screen in the cell came on. The terminal that had been locked to a legal information database. The status display above the door. The emergency information panel on the wall that was designed to show evacuation routes in case of building emergency and that was currently showing something else entirely. All of them. Same image. Same moment. A single symbol, clean lines on a dark background, geometric and precise and completely unlike anything in council iconography or the visual language of any of the 11 species represented on the council or any species in the galactic registry that Dara had access to. She recognized it immediately. She had spent 6 weeks reading Terran archive data in a cold basement and she had seen this symbol in the oldest section of those records, used in context that the surrounding text described as confirmation signals, acknowledgement marks, the specific notation used when a message had been received across a distance that made confirmation difficult but not impossible. The label in the archive had been simple. Receipt confirmed. Message received. Dara looked at it on every screen in the room simultaneously. She thought about 2,000 years. About a promise written in the last logs of a withdrawal that had been the hardest decision a civilization had ever made. About the station at the edge of the void that had woken up recently, quietly, without announcing itself to anyone except the instruments of a young archaeologist who had followed evidence into the dark. She thought about the 3 outer species and the council fleet already moving toward them. Then she sat back on the bench and felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in 3 years of working alone toward a conclusion that nobody around her would accept. It was not certainty. It was not relief. It was something quieter than both of those things, the specific feeling that comes when you have done the right thing without knowing if it would matter and have just received the smallest possible indication that it might. She stayed with it for a while. Outside the holding cell the building was completely quiet. But somewhere in the galaxy, something that had been waiting for 2,000 years had just received a message and confirmed it, and the silence that followed was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of something that had already begun. The 6 days were the longest of Dara's life. Not because the holding cell was uncomfortable, though it was not particularly comfortable either. Not because the administrative proceedings were unpleasant, though the formal interview with the council's communications compliance officer had been a 2-hour exercise in answering questions with the complete truth and watching the answers be received as evidence of instability rather than honesty. The 6 days were long because of the specific quality of waiting that comes when you have done something irreversible and have no information about whether it mattered and no way to get any. She was allowed reading material from the legal database. She read procedural documents about unauthorized use of council communication infrastructure and tried to assess what the realistic outcome of her case looked like. The honest assessment was not encouraging. The charges were real, the evidence was straightforward, and the only defense available to her was that the communication had been sent in good faith based on genuine research findings, which was true but which the council had already formally classified as unsupported mythology in her official performance review. On the 3rd day her case officer informed her that additional charges were being considered relating to the potential dissemination of false information capable of causing public concern. She thanked him for the update and went back to her bench. On the 4th day she thought mostly about the symbol on the screens. Whether it had been a real confirmation or something her mind had constructed from 3 months of immersive research into a civilization she had come to understand in ways that were probably not professionally appropriate to admit. She had been sleep-deprived. She had been under significant stress. The screens had done something unusual and her pattern-recognizing brain had found a match in the archive data she had been saturating herself with for weeks. She went back and forth on it for most of the 4th day. On the 5th day she stopped going back and forth and simply accepted that she did not know and that not knowing was the condition she was in and that the right response to that condition was patience rather than the particular mental circling that was not producing any new conclusions and was making her tired. The 5th day was better. The 6th day was quiet. On the 7th day Dara was sitting on her bench reading a procedural document about appeal timelines when the building's ambient sound changed. She noticed it before she could identify it. A quality to the air, a shift in the background hum of systems and ventilation and the distant ordinary noise of an administrative building that had been her constant environment for 6 days. Something in that background had changed and her attention came up from the document before her conscious mind had finished processing what the change was. Then she heard voices in the corridor outside. Not the measured professional exchanges of security staff going about routine work. Faster than that, with an urgency underneath them that institutional corridors did not usually carry. Then the voices stopped. The building went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. It was the middle of the day and administrative buildings did not go quiet in the middle of the day unless something had redirected everyone's attention to the same place at the same time. Dara set down her reading material and sat straight on the bench and waited. 12 minutes earlier, Supreme Commander Vex had been reviewing deployment logistics for the outer sector operation when her command station flagged a priority alert from the long-range sensor network. She had received priority alerts before. In 40 years of military service she had received hundreds of them and she had developed the particular calm that experienced commanders develop around alert systems. The understanding that priority designations existed on a spectrum and that the appropriate response to most of them was measured attention rather than immediate alarm. She opened the alert. She read it. She closed it and opened it again because the numbers in it were not numbers that her experience had any framework for and she wanted to confirm she had read them correctly the first time. She had read them correctly. 3 sensor stations had already flagged equipment failure by the time the data reached her level, which was the automatic response of operators who had received readings outside the boundaries of what their calibration was designed to measure and had assumed the most rational explanation. The equipment failure reports had been followed within minutes by corrections from the same operators confirming that their diagnostics showed full function and that the data was accurate. Vex called her senior analyst to her station. He was a careful and experienced officer named Reed who had spent 20 years in council intelligence and who Vex trusted specifically because he did not tell her what she wanted to hear. She showed him the data without comment. Reed looked at it for longer than she had. He ran 2 verification queries against the sensor network status logs and checked the calibration records for the 3 stations that had initially reported equipment failure. He did not speak during any of this. When he finished he straightened up and looked at Vex with an expression she had not seen on him before. She sent him away. Then she sat alone with the number. 10,000 ships. The sensor network was not showing a fleet massing at a single point or approaching from a single direction. It was showing simultaneous contacts distributed throughout the entire boundary of Council space, contacts that had appeared at the same moment across a region so large that the coordination required to place them there simultaneously represented a navigational and tactical capability that nothing in the Council's threat assessment database had ever flagged as possible. They were not moving. Every contact was holding its position with a precision that suggested the positions had been chosen deliberately and that holding them was not an effort. They were simply there, surrounding everything. Present in the way that something is present when it has decided to be visible and has the capacity to be visible anywhere it chooses. Every communication channel on every council frequency opened at the same moment. Vex had been in war rooms when multiple channels activated simultaneously and the noise was always overwhelming, voices and signals overlapping into something that required trained operators to sort through. This was not like that. When every channel opened the result was not noise. It was a single voice, clear and calm, speaking without any of the artifacts that translation systems produced because it was not being translated. It was simply speaking. All 11 council languages simultaneously, with the natural rhythm and weight of a native speaker in each one, which should not have been possible for a single voice and which was happening anyway. This is Admiral Tom Reeves of the Terran Federation. The name meant nothing to anyone in council space except one person currently sitting in a holding cell on an administrative level. To everyone else it was simply a name attached to a voice attached to 10,000 warships that had appeared from nowhere and surrounded everything they had ever built. The threshold conditions have been met. We have returned as promised. Vex stared at her screens. At the sensor contacts distributed evenly around the entirety of council space like a boundary that had been drawn overnight by something that knew exactly where the boundary needed to be. We have received a communication from a member of your population. She did not move. She asked us to help 3 species that your council is currently moving against. We are asking you to stop. The pause that followed was short and clean and had the quality of something that was not a dramatic effect but simply the natural space between one thought and the next. We remember everyone the council forgot. The channels closed simultaneously. The silence that followed was absolute in a way that Vex had not experienced in 4 decades of military service. Her command station was staffed by trained professionals who had procedures for every contingency and who were currently sitting completely still because there were no procedures for this and everyone in the room understood that simultaneously. The council chamber assembled in 53 minutes, which was the fastest full assembly in its 2,000-year history by a significant margin. 11 species in the Great Circle, every platform occupied, every representative present, and the silence when the last member took their seat was the silence of people who had just received information that did not fit inside any existing framework and were sitting with the specific discomfort of that fact. The sensor data was displayed on the central hologram. 10,000 contacts. Stationary. Surrounding everything. Nobody spoke for a long time. In the holding cell, Dara felt the building change before she understood why. The ambient sound shifted first, the same way it had shifted on the 7th morning, but larger this time and faster. The background noise of a functioning administrative building dropping away and being replaced by something that was not quite silence because the systems were still running but that had the quality of silence because every human element of the building's sound had stopped at the same time. Then she heard the footsteps in the corridor slow down and stop. Then nothing. She sat on her bench in a building that had gone quiet in the middle of the day and looked at the locked terminal on the wall and waited. She did not know what had happened. She had no access to sensor data or news broadcasts or any external information source. She had only the quality of the silence around her and what that silence felt like and what her mind did with that feeling. Her mind went to the symbol on the screen 6 days ago. To the archive records and the threshold document and the frequency she had entered manually into a basement terminal at 2 in the morning. To the voice in those records that had written "We will return" with the complete confidence of someone who meant it and had built everything necessary to make it true. She looked at the wall. Somewhere above her, she suspected, the galaxy was in the process of learning something that she had spent 3 years trying to tell it. She sat very still and waited to find out what happened next. Vex had built her entire career on certainty. Not arrogance, though her critics had used that word and she had never spent much energy disputing it. Certainty was different from arrogance. Arrogance was confidence without foundation. Certainty was confidence built from 40 years of decisions made, outcomes observed, lessons absorbed and applied and tested again until the foundation was solid enough that uncertainty felt like a condition that happened to other people in situations they had not prepared for adequately. She had prepared for everything. That was not a boast. It was a professional commitment she had maintained since her first command posting, the understanding that preparation was the only honest response to a galaxy that did not care about your expectations. She had prepared for wars and diplomatic failures and internal council fractures and the dozen different scenarios her strategic planning teams had modeled over the years as low probability but non-zero possibilities. She had not prepared for this because this was not a scenario anyone had modeled. You could not model a scenario built on the assumption that a myth was real. The modeling required a foundation of accepted possibility, and the accepted possibility had not existed until approximately 4 hours ago when 10,000 ships appeared simultaneously around everything the Council had ever controlled, and a voice that spoke 11 languages without a translator asked them a single quiet question. Vex stood at her command station and looked at her screens and felt the unfamiliar weight of not knowing what the right answer was. The contacts were still there. Every sensor array in Council space was still returning the same readings, 10,000 positions maintained with a stillness that spoke of either automated systems or a level of crew discipline that her military mind could not help but assess professionally and assess as extraordinary. They had not moved in 4 hours. They had not sent follow-up transmissions. They had made their request and gone quiet and were now simply waiting with the patience of something that had already waited 2,000 years and found one more day entirely manageable. Admiral Reeves had not made demands. That was the part that kept returning to her as the Council debate ran through its 4th hour. Every scenario her training had prepared her for involved demands. Ultimatums with timelines. Conditions with consequences attached. The architecture of coercion that all military engagement eventually reduced to, the fundamental grammar of force which was do this or we do that. Reeves had not used that grammar. He had stated facts. The threshold conditions were met, the return had been promised, the promise was being kept. He had noted the communication from Dara and described it accurately as a request rather than a trigger. He had asked the Council to stop the outer sector operation. And then he had framed the entire thing as a question about whether peace was possible and invited the Council to answer it through action rather than words. It was, Vex thought during the 3rd hour of debate, the most tactically sophisticated communication she had ever received. Not because it was clever in a manipulative sense. Because it was honest in a way that left no comfortable ground to stand on if your intention was to avoid accountability for what you chose next. The Council could not claim they were acting under threat because no threat had been made. They could not claim the request was unreasonable because releasing one archaeologist and halting one military operation were not unreasonable things to be asked. They could not claim the framing was coercive because the framing was explicitly the opposite of coercive. Whatever they decided, they were deciding it freely, and Admiral Reeves had constructed the situation so that the freedom was undeniable and the decision therefore entirely their own. She listened to every argument the chamber produced across 4 hours. The voices that called it coercion regardless of framing because the presence of 10,000 warships changed the nature of any request made in their shadow. She understood that argument. It was not wrong. The power differential was real and pretending it did not exist served nobody honestly. The voices that pointed out the Terran fleet had done nothing aggressive, had targeted nothing, had made no threatening movements in 4 hours of waiting, and that the Council initiating any hostile response to a fleet that had not acted hostilely would be recorded in history as a decision made from pride rather than strategy. She understood that argument too. The voices that said something quieter and harder to argue with, that the legend had carried something true in it all along and that 2,000 years of galactic history had been built in the presence of a promise that was now being kept and that the appropriate response to a promise being kept was not to reach for weapons. Vex voted last because she was Supreme Commander and because the weight of the vote deserved to be felt fully before it was cast. She cast it. The formal communication to the Terran fleet was drafted by the Council's senior diplomatic staff and reviewed by 4 separate departments and marked with every official seal the Chamber's protocol office could attach to a single document. Vex watched the process with the detached recognition that institutions did this, reached for formality and procedure when the substance of what was happening was too large to hold directly, used the dignified machinery of official process to give shape to something that had arrived without asking permission and that the machinery had not been designed to accommodate. The document said yes. That was the substance of it underneath all the formal language. Yes to releasing the archaeologist. Yes to restoring her research. Yes to halting the outer sector operation pending a full council review of the authorization and its underlying justifications. Yes to the question Admiral Reeves had asked. Peace is possible. Here is the evidence. The transmission went out and the council chamber went quiet again and everyone waited for the response from 10,000 ships that had been patient for 4 hours and that Vex suspected had been patient for considerably longer than that in ways she was only beginning to understand. The response came back in 11 minutes. A single line from Admiral Reeves, transmitted on every council frequency simultaneously, in all 11 languages, in the same calm voice that had opened every channel 4 hours ago. Thank you. We will be in touch. Nothing else. No conditions, no follow-up requests, no outline of what came next. Just that, and then the channels closed again and the 10,000 contacts on the sensor arrays remained exactly where they were, patient and present and no longer feeling to Vex the way they had felt 4 hours ago. 4 hours ago they had felt like a wall. Now they felt like something else. She did not have the right word for it yet. Dara heard the door of the holding cell unlock at 17 minutes past the hour. The sound was small and mechanical and completely ordinary and it was the best sound she had heard in 6 days. She stood up from the bench before the door was fully open. A council administrator came through first, a mid-level official she did not recognize, carrying her bag in both hands with the careful manner of someone transporting evidence that had recently been reclassified as personal property. Her tablet was on top. Her 4 drives were inside. Her handwritten notes were in the outer pocket where she had put them the night she was brought in. The administrator also carried a document. Printed on formal council paper with the kind of header that appeared on official corrections, the kind of document that institutions produced when they needed to acknowledge that a previous institutional decision had been wrong without using language that admitted the previous institutional decision had been wrong. She read it in the corridor. Her research had been restored to the official record. Her position as lead archaeologist had been reinstated effective immediately. Her performance review had been corrected with a formal notation that the previous assessment had been made on incomplete information. The word mythology did not appear anywhere in the correction. She stood in the corridor outside the holding cell and held her bag and her tablet and the formal document and did not speak for a moment because the moment was large enough that speaking into it immediately felt wrong. Then she looked at her tablet. The screen had stayed on through 6 days in an evidence container, which should have drained the battery entirely and had not. The display showed what it had shown when they took it from her. The symbol. Clean lines on a dark background, the oldest mark in the Terran archive, the confirmation notation used to cross impossible distances. Still there. Still clear. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she walked to the nearest window at the end of the corridor and looked out at the city and at the sky above it and thought about 10,000 ships sitting at the boundaries of council space, patient and present, not as a threat and not as an occupying force but as something the galaxy had not had in a very long time. A presence that had come back not to take anything but to make sure the things worth protecting were protected. The 3 outer species received their notifications that afternoon. The Council fleet had been recalled. The absorption proceedings were cancelled. A formal Council communication informed them that their independent status was confirmed and that a review of Council expansion policy in the outer sectors had been initiated. Dara read the notifications from her restored workstation in the archive building, no longer in the basement, reinstated to her original office on the 3rd floor where the windows faced east and the morning light came in at an angle that made the room feel larger than it was. She opened a new research file. She labeled it simply, Terran Federation. She thought about Admiral Tom Reeves and his calm voice and the question he had asked the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy with 10,000 ships at his back and the patience of 2,000 years behind him. She thought about Elena Vasquez and the final log entry that Dara had read in a cold basement at 2 in the morning and that had sent her to a communications terminal with a message she had not been sure anyone would receive. We were here. We will be here again. She began to write. Not the formal academic record, though that would come later and she would write it carefully and completely. Something else first. The actual account of what had happened, from the moment she had followed anomalous energy readings to the edge of the void to the moment a council administrator had handed her back her bag in a corridor outside a holding cell. The full story in plain language for anyone who needed to understand how the myth had become the truth. Which was everyone. Which was the whole galaxy, slowly waking up to the fact that the story it had been telling itself about being alone in the management of the universe was not the story that had actually been happening. Outside her window the city looked exactly as it always had. The same buildings, the same traffic patterns, the same sky that had been the same sky for as long as anyone currently alive had been alive. But somewhere at the edge of that sky, at the boundaries of everything the Council had ever mapped and registered and called known space, something that had been absent for 2,000 years was present again. Not watching from a distance anymore. Oh.